Tēnā koutou katoa. This class is about using evidence to guide the management of disability and long-term conditions. And today we are focusing on clinical guidelines, the critical appraisal of clinical guidelines, and how to tell a good clinical guideline from a bad clinical guideline. So first of all, what is a clinical guideline? A clinical guideline is a collection of systematically developed statements to assist practitioners and patients' decisions about appropriate healthcare for specific clinical circumstances. So clinical guidelines can focus on decisions around what treatments are best for particular conditions in particular situations. They can also focus on questions to do with the best ways of diagnosing conditions and on the best way of identifying problems associated with the conditions. They can focus on issues to do with acute medicine all the way through to community-based long-term condition management. There's no one recommended approach to the development of a clinical guideline. There are multiple sort of strategies and ways of undertaking guideline development. However, all guidelines should involve some sort of systematic approach to synthesis and interpretation of knowledge, and both the integration of research evidence and expert opinion. So where systematic reviews tend to stop at the level of summary of information from research findings, clinical guidelines are much more about the translation of that information to clinical practice, and so there is a necessary level of interpretation required in terms of how research evidence is used. Therefore, evaluation of guidelines is very subjective. However, it's very important for you to know what a good guideline looks like, because there are guidelines do range in quality, and it is possible to critically appraise guidelines as you might critically appraise a single randomized controlled trial or observational study or systematic review. So don't take clinical guidelines at face value. You should always be thinking about getting information about how the clinical guideline was developed, what methods were used, and therefore how trustworthy are the conclusions that have come from that clinical guideline. So robust guidelines in general need to be, or aim to be, valid. So they need to use information to result in health improvements in health outcomes or health gains. They need to be reliable, and by that we might think of if we got two groups of people to develop the same guideline, you would hope that they both come up with the same recommendations and based on the same information. So they should be reliable. They should be representative, and this is an interesting element of clinical guidelines, that clinical guidelines need to represent the perspectives of all key stakeholders involved. And here the word stakeholder should be interpreted as broadly as possible to include the people who provide healthcare services, through to the people who use those healthcare services and their families and supporters. So good clinical guidelines should involve consumer input, for example, in terms of deciding what the right questions to ask are for that clinical guideline, and how to interpret and implement evidence when it is identified. Good clinical guidelines also need to be flexible. You don't want to be too rigid in terms of coming up with rules around what should and shouldn't happen in clinical practice, because necessarily there will always be cases where rules cannot be followed or should not be followed for particular people and in particular circumstances, and so clinical guidelines need a degree of flexibility. And finally, clinical guidelines should be research-based, so they should be based on systematic reviews of the literature. When it comes to critical appraisal of guidelines, one of the most dominant tools to use internationally is, in the marketplace I was going to say, internationally, is the AGREE instrument. AGREE stands for the Appraisal of Guidelines, Research and Evaluation, and there's a website you can go to where you can download this tool for free, and there's a really good manual that goes with it in terms of how to apply it to the interpretation, critical appraisal of guidelines. I've got I'm going to be talking a bit about the Agree tool now. So most of this rest of this lecture is going to be talking about how to make sense of the Agree tool and the component parts of it. I'm going to be drawing on one example of two guidelines that I've recently been involved in reading. Last year, which was 2019, I was part of a group of people who was contributing to some work from the World Health Organization, looking at developing information about minimum packages of care for rehabilitation of the top 10 most disabling conditions. And the condition that I was involved with providing information on was chronic obstructive lung disease, the fourth leading killer of people internationally, I believe. One of the jobs we were tasked with was, first of all, to identify all guidelines that had been published or updated in the last 10 years that were about rehabilitation for chronic obstructive lung disease. We then had to critically appraise those guidelines and draw recommendations from the guidelines. We were meant to identify the top sort of 3 or 4 or 5 guidelines to draw information from, rather than extracting data from dozens of guidelines that said the same thing. So we were meant to pick the top 5 guidelines to draw information from. There were a number of criteria we were using to do this, but one of these criteria was around the scientific rigor of the guidelines, and we used the Agree tool to do this part of. So one of the guidelines we ended up picking for inclusion in our critical appraisal of these guidelines was this one, called the Global Strategy for the Diagnosis, Management and Prevention of Chronic Obstructive Pulmonary Disease, COPD. This guideline is often referred to as the Gold Guideline. It is the most commonly cited guideline associated with the management of COPD internationally. There's one chapter, or a couple of chapters, that refer to rehabilitation interventions in this guideline. It also includes stuff to do with acute medical management as well. The second guideline from this population I want to talk about is this one here from the Australian New Zealand from the Australian New Zealand Thoracic Society about the Australian New Zealand Pulmonary Rehabilitation Clinical Practice Guidelines. These were 2 of the 5 guidelines we picked for extracting data on for this particular project, and I want to just use these to highlight to provide some examples, I guess, in terms of the application of the critical appraisal tool, the Agree tool. So just going back to my presentation here. The Agree tool, its purpose is to provide a framework for evaluating the quality of clinical practice guidelines. It was developed in the UK by this group called the Agree Collaboration, and it's I should say part of the reason for that is the UK does a lot of work in the clinical guidelines space. They've got this group called NICE. That provides a lot of sort of guidelines for clinical services in the UK. So this is part of the reason why this Agree collaboration was created. It's based on theoretical assumptions rather than empirical evidence. And what I mean by that is that the criteria that are considered important, that you score a guideline against within the Agree tool, is based on expert opinion about the sorts of things that you should see in a good guideline. There's no, I guess, studies that have demonstrated that if you follow these principles as opposed to other principles, you produce better health outcomes. So that's just sort of like a proviso regarding this particular tool. That having been said, the Agree tool is widely used and widely accepted internationally as the tool to use when you are critically appraising guidelines. So the Agree tool has, I'm going to swap my display settings over here a bit. The Agree tool has 23 items that cover 6 domains. I'm going to be talking about the 6 domains separately, and then touch on some of the elements that will contribute to those 6 domains. Each item is scored on a scale of 1 to 4, where a score of 4 indicates that you strongly agree that that particular criteria for a guideline has been met, and a 1 is strongly disagree. Interestingly, it looks at issues to do with utility, how usable a clinical guideline is, and how how much it represents the stakeholders' perspective, as well as the validity and reliability of the methods that were used to develop the guidelines. And the recommendation is that you have at least 2 independent appraisers use the agreed tool to critically appraise guidelines, and then you compare their results for a final score. So the 6 domains, did I say 6? Yes, 6 domains. The 6 domains that are covered by the agreed tool cover scope and purpose, number 1, and number 2, stakeholder involvement, number 3, rigor of development. So number 3 is the one that might be most about the methods used to develop the guidelines. Number 4 is clarity and presentation. Number 5 is applicability. How useful is this guideline in practice? And fascinatingly, number 6 is editorial independence. Were the people influenced by whoever paid them to produce the guideline in terms of the recommendations that they reached? So the first domain here is around scope and purpose, and in the agreed tool, this covers questions such as are the overall objectives of the guidelines specifically described? Are the clinical questions covered by the guidelines specifically described? And are the patients for whom the guideline is meant to apply specifically described? Like, is it clear who the guideline is about and what the guideline people what questions they endeavoured to answer when they went about doing producing the guidelines? So if I just jump back to the gold tool, one of the interesting things about the gold tool is that there is an overall sort of statement somewhere in here near the beginning around the purpose of the guidelines, somewhere in here. Something about providing feedback for supporting decision making and so forth, but the objectives of the guidelines is published, is documented at a very high level in the gold guidelines. Bear in mind this is the most cited guidelines for COPD internationally, and the actual kind of review questions are not clearly articulated within the guideline itself. There is sort of reference to a group that was set up to develop and manage the methodology that was used to produce these guidelines. In my work for the World Health Organization last year, I did try to make contact with this group to get some more information about the methods they use for aspects of the guideline production, and I didn't get a response. So I don't know if there's more behind the scenes in terms of structure and rigor. But what I would say is that the overall objective of this guideline is kind of broadly described, but the actual clinical questions they're trying to answer don't seem to be predetermined. They were developed, I guess, in the process of reading the evidence that arose. So to compare this to the Australia-New Zealand pulmonary rehabilitation guidelines, and right at the beginning they've got like a clear statement about scope and purpose. So they've got a very clear statement about the scope and purposes, and under methodology they talk about doing systematic reviews and then having specific questions that they were trying to answer with their guidelines, and each of these questions has been written as a PICO statement. If you remember, P equals population, I equals intervention, C equals control, O equals outcome. And so each of these questions has been operationalized as a specific question to do with COPD that they have endeavored to answer. And these guys had a set of about I can't remember how many questions they had, maybe a dozen questions. So they had specific questions that they wanted to answer. So what this means is that the gold guideline here is probably more is broader ranging in terms of its scope, because they didn't limit what they wanted to look at. But the Australia-New Zealand guideline is more specific in scope. So you've got a clear idea about what they what information they're trying to seek from the outset. Stating up front what information you're trying to seek improves the trustworthiness of the guideline, because it keeps the guideline producers honest. They didn't create questions based on what evidence turned up or what they sort of felt was important from the evidence that turned up. They pre-specified what questions they were trying to answer. So, second, all stakeholder involvement. Did the guideline groups include individuals from all relevant professional groups? Were patient views and preferences sought? Were the target users of the guidelines clearly defined? And was the guideline piloted amongst target users? So there's quite a high bar here set in terms of how stakeholders, users of the guideline, patients that the guidelines was about, family members associated with the patients of the guideline, how these people were involved in terms of developing the guideline methodologies, interpreting the information that was gathered, and so on and so forth. So let's look for that information in these two guidelines that I've been talking about. The guideline on the GOLD guideline talks about the development of a GOLD scientific committee that was established to review research on COPD management and prevention. They provide a bit more information about its members being recognised leaders in COPD research and clinical practice with scientific credentials to contribute to the task of the committee, and so on. So down here at the bottom of the page they have a bit more information about who these committee members are, and it's not clear from the information provided here what the professional backgrounds of these people are, or even if any of them are consumers, for instance. I did a bit of a sort of an extra dig outside of the information provided in this guideline to try and figure out who these people were, and as far as I could tell, the vast majority of these people, if not all of them, were respiratory physicians. So this guideline was produced primarily by one professional group, being a very knowledgeable group, respiratory physicians, but the perspectives of consumers and family members and so forth is not brought to bear on the recommendations coming from these guidelines. And elsewhere in this methodology there's no additional information that I could find about the involvement of other stakeholders in interpreting the information that they've produced. In comparison, the New Zealand and the Australia-New Zealand pulmonary rehabilitation guidelines talk about, they've got information at the beginning about all the people who are involved in the production of this guideline up here. And there's a whole list of them from different backgrounds: physiology, lots of physios, some medicine, respiratory medicine backgrounds, pulmonary rehabilitation, a pulmonary rehabilitation centre coordinator, so a practice person, exercise physiologists, and there's different people from different backgrounds who are contributing to this particular guideline. And then further down in the methodology section, in this particular guideline, they talk about the guidelines once they were in draft format being reviewed by the New Zealand Cardiothoracic Physiotherapy Special Interest Group, consumer representatives, the Clinical Care and Resources Subcommittee, nursing, COPD, physio, and olive special interest groups of the Thoracic Society of New Zealand. So there's quite a lot more information about stakeholders that were involved, who were involved in the interpretation and reporting of the effectiveness of this guideline. The third domain is around the rigor associated with the development of the guideline, and this is what we might more traditionally consider critical appraisal of a methodology. So this focuses on what methods were used to search for evidence. Were they systematic? What criteria were used for selecting the evidence, and is this clearly described? What methods were used for formulating the recommendations, and are these clearly described? Were the health benefits considered, as well as the side effects and the risks in formulating recommendations? And there's a bunch of other questions as well in this part of the AGREE tool along these sorts of lines. So fascinatingly, in the GOLD tool, there's actually very little information that's provided about how the people, the authors of this guideline, went about producing their conclusions that they reported on in this guideline. There's reference here to a search strategy being used, but there's just a tiny little bit of information about the types of fields that were searched, not a reportable search strategy. There was a little bit of information about how members of this committee received summaries, a summary of citations in all abstracts, and how they went through providing decisions. And there's a reference here to the quite a sort of subjective process where members evaluated the abstract, and subject to their own judgment, the full publication by answering a couple of questions. And then the committee met on a sort of twice yearly basis to discuss each publication in order to make recommendations about what impact should be derived from that particular publication. And conclusions were based on consensus of that group. So there's actually very little information about how critical appraisal was conducted, how critical appraisal informed decision making, and what sorts of information they were seeking when they were undertaking the sort of decision making process. It's a little bit thin on the ground. The Australia and New Zealand Pulmonary Rehabilitation Guidelines is a bit more detailed. In fact, they've got a big section about methodology that includes a bunch of clear statements about their objectives. They talk about having a systematic approach to the literature search. They provide more information about how these systematic reviews were conducted. They have a section on critical appraisal where they've reported on using the grade tool from the Cochrane Group in order to evaluate and rate the strength of evidence around particular areas of recommendation, and how that sort of process was arrived at. It's by no means perfect. There is still some missing information, but the Australian New Zealand Pulmonary Rehabilitation Guidelines provides much more information than the Gold Guidelines in terms of how they went about actually arriving at the decisions that are reported in these guidelines. The next criteria in the AGREE tool is asks about the clarity of the results and the presentation of these as well. So are the recommendations from the guidelines specific and unambiguous? Is it very clear what they're actually recommending? Are different options for management of the condition presented? Are key recommendations clearly identifiable? Lastly, is there sort of a guideline? Is the guideline supported with tools for application? So in terms of the Gold Guideline and the Australian New Zealand Pulmonary Rehabilitation Guideline, both of these guidelines are very clear in terms of the presentation of their guidelines. So in the Gold Guidelines, they've got very, very clear evidence statements with strength of evidence associated with each statement, and so there's a clear sort of like statement about a recommendation, and then around that there's sort of like an expanded sort of discussion associated with that particular recommendation, with citations going back to the original research. So that's pretty good. In the Australian New Zealand guideline, they've got a similar thing where they've got like a really strongly stated recommendation with the word recommendation, so it's very clear, and then information about justification, implementation of these recommendations in clinical practice. What does this recommendation actually mean? And then prior to these things, you've got a bit more information that provides a summary of the evidence that supports that particular recommendation. So both of these guidelines are pretty strong when it comes to clarity of expression. Neither of them really provide a tool for implementing the guideline, although there are tools elsewhere where things can be implemented. So there are tools for making recommendations about what sorts of things you should be delivering within a pulmonary rehabilitation program. But these guidelines themselves don't sort of address this particular point. This last one here is the guideline supported by tools for application. In comparison, I want to pull up a comparison. The Australasian stroke guidelines was developed with a fantastic tool for assisting with implementation, using this thing called Inform Me, and I'm wondering if I can just go straight to it. View Inform Me's clinical guidelines now. Very easy for me to find. It's got the guidelines here. Let's go for clinical guidelines, and the content here. There's a sort of very easily navigatable sort of menu, and if we're looking at something like rehabilitation in here around early supported discharge, for example, we can click on that. It takes us to an area in this particular guideline where there is information and recommendations and information about what you actually have to do and who's responsible for it, and all that kind of thing. Let me dig up an example. I've got to agree to the terms and service use first of all. Now we're cooking. So easily navigatable information about the methodology, the review questions, an overview of the findings. So this is the one that I was sort of asking about in particular. They've got a statement which is a strong recommendation, and if I wanted to view more information, I can click on this and it provides me with the sort of drop down menu. So it's much more sort of navigatable with sort of a tool that sort of makes it easier for people to apply it to clinical practice, and this is sort of like a living document that's updated when new evidence is added. So this is an example of a tool for assisting with application of a guideline. Let's talk about this second to last criteria, which is around the applicability of a particular rule, of a guideline. This asks questions about whether or not potential organisational barriers have been addressed or identified in applying the recommendations, and have these been discussed. What are the costs associated with applying the recommendations? Does the guideline present a key review criteria for monitoring or for auditing purposes? Like, how would we know whether or not we are meeting these guideline criteria? For both of the New Zealand Australian Pulmonary Rehabilitation Guideline and the Gold Guideline from the US, both of those, the international guidelines, both of those criteria are pretty middling in terms of information that can be used to help with the application of these guidelines in clinical practice. There's an assumption that other organisations or other documents, other tools will be used for application purposes, but they are a bit short information in that regard. And finally, there's a question here about editorial independence. So this asks the question, who paid for the guideline and what influence did they have over the production of the guideline? Were conflicts of interest in the production of the guideline identified, recorded and addressed? What we want to know here is that were any of the people who were responsible for creating the recommendations potentially unduly influenced by their own commercial interest in one particular recommendation over another? And that's kind of quite a complicated question. So in the Gold Guidelines, there actually isn't much you can actually find in terms of funding or conflict of interest. There's conflicting results, but nothing about conflicts of interest. I wonder if we've got interest in here even. Tremendous interest. Other interests. So there's actually nothing that's easy to find that actually provides information about whether or who paid for this guideline production and what interest or influence the person who funded the guideline or the organisation that funded the guideline had over the recommendations or results. I would presume not much, but we're not told that information in the guideline itself, so we really don't know. The New Zealand, Australian and New Zealand Pulmonary Rehabilitation Guidelines, in comparison, has this very specific statement about conflicts of interest, where they've stated that they don't have conflicts of interest, and also a statement about funding sources, that the writing group was editorially independent from any of the funding sources of the Lung Foundation Australia, who paid for this particular thing, and did not receive any funding from external sources for the production of this particular review. I was involved in the New Zealand Traumatic Brain Injury Guidelines back in 2006, some time ago, that were funded by ACC. And ACC was really keen to ensure that the guidelines were produced by this group called the New Zealand Guidelines Group at the time, and that they were produced in a way where it was editorially independent from ACC. So ACC could say, we didn't actually say what these recommendations should recommend. We're just wanting to make sure that they are produced well, so we've funded them. And ACC had representatives who turned up to some of the key meetings for that guideline group production, but they were only observers, just to witness the production of this guideline, to make sure that what they're spending money on, I guess, was progressing as intended, but they didn't participate in those meetings at all. So that was my sort of personal experience of a funder who provided money for a guideline produced, but allowed the guideline to produce without any influence from them. So those are the sort of 6 criteria for production of a guideline. I'll swap this over again. Each of the criteria that the items that are identified in the Agree tool can be individually scored on the scale of 1 to 4, depending on the degree to which you can sort of say with surety, yes, that criteria was met or that item was met. There's a process in the Agree tool where if you have multiple appraisers, and you need to have at least 2 according to the Agree method, you can sort of average scores and use this as a way of coming up with a total possible score for guidelines. And this was the method, part of the method that we use for evaluating which guidelines were better than other guidelines in the little bit of work I was doing last year for the World Health Organization. So the Agree tool specifies that you can produce scores for each domain. So you can produce a score for each of the 6 domains, but it wouldn't be appropriate to score the total domains. That wouldn't be meaningful. So it wouldn't be meaningful to add a score of editorial independence to a score of applicability. It doesn't sort of mean anything. So the scores in the Agree tool are meant to be 6 scores for the 6 domains. And the scores are really only there for a guide. They don't say that there is a cut-off point of 3 or 4 to say that a guideline is good or bad in terms of that particular criteria. So just to bring you to your attention, there are a number of groups that produce guidelines on a regular basis. We used to have a group in New Zealand called the New Zealand Guidelines Group, and they did some fantastic work in their time, but appetite for funding guidelines waned in New Zealand in sort of 2010, I think it was, sometime around there. But there are these other groups internationally that produce these guidelines. One of these is the NICE Institute in the UK. That's a group that's really worth looking up. If you've got an area of clinical practice that you're wanting to learn more about, it's worth just searching their website. Often they have a wealth of resources for a large range of rare as well as common conditions. So that's a good place to go to get information about current guidelines. There's a Scottish group called SIGN as well, and they produce their own guidelines as well. There is the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, the US group. I think this was a group that was, I've written here, slow death by budget cuts over 10 years and eventually disbanded. But I'm pretty sure that the guidelines that they produced have been popped into a sort of a repository that's still accessible. Although over time these guidelines will be increasingly out of date, I guess. This is the Stroke Foundation's clinical guidelines that I was referring to before. I think this is an example of a truly excellent guideline, really transparent in terms of how it was produced, with really excellent tools for implementation, guided by with resources for consumer users of the guidelines versus patients versus professional users as well. So this is a fantastic bit of ongoing work, in fact. So in conclusion, clinical guidelines involve both evidence synthesis, so that's the scientific part of it, and interpretation of the evidence from a clinical perspective, to make sure that the research evidence is being described and reported in a way that means that information can actually be translated into better practice in actual care. The quality of guidelines can vary widely, and even very commonly reported guidelines aren't necessarily conducted with the best methodologies. The Agree tool is a really good tool for, or provides a good framework, I should say, for critical appraisal of guidelines. And just to let you know, the production and quality of guidelines can be subject to political bias, which is why it's really important to look at that last domain in the Agree tool around who funded it and what their influences were. So I think that's it from me. It's a shorter lecture today than yesterday's lecture. Good luck with your work, and feel free to drop me a line if you've got any questions about critical appraisal of clinical guidelines. Thanks a lot.